Welcome back to the Public Housing Resident Organizing and Participation Toolkit training series. This training series is meant to walk public housing residents through how to organize and run a successful resident council so that you can improve your housing and community. We encourage you to participate in the entire training series.
This training is based on 3 of the sample resident council documents from the toolkit: the sample resident council procedures, as well as the sample forms for resident council meetings, and the sample forms for resident council elections, which will help you to carry out the procedures. As we go through the training, you may want to follow along with the documents.
The sample resident council procedures in this toolkit provide
Specific sample procedures related to
membership meetings,
board meetings,
board member responsibilities,
board elections,
recall elections, and
filling board vacancies midterm.
your resident council can copy the procedures that you want to implement or update the optional fields and use the procedures suggested here.
The sample forms for resident council meetings and the ones for elections provide forms and notices to carry out the procedures that you can easily update and customize.
Before moving into specifics, here are some key overview points for the training.
These sample procedures are based off of the sample bylaws provided in the toolkit.
The procedures provide detail for carrying out important resident council functions, particularly running meetings and electing board members and officers.
The sample documents provide templates for carrying out the procedures, such as sign-in sheet forms and notices for meetings.
In carrying out resident council functions, it's important to safeguard residents' personal information and only collect information that is necessary.
Let's talk about privacy.
At times, resident councils need to collect personal information from members, particularly contact information, so you can stay in touch with residents and let them know about meetings and activities. Resident councils have a responsibility to safeguard members' personally identifiable information, often called PII. PII includes information stored on paper or electronically.
The resident council should only collect information about individuals that is relevant and necessary.
Consider,
Do you truly need this information? For example, if you want to acknowledge members' birthdays, consider only collecting their birth month and not their full birth date.
could the information be collected anonymously? If you are conducting a survey that asks about demographic information, such as age, race, and employment, consider making the survey anonymous.
When you do store personal information, ensure that both electronic and paper records are stored with safeguards. Do not distribute personal information, including contact information, to anyone without that person's prior agreement. Only consider requests if you are first convinced that the release of contact information is authorized, proper, and necessary.
Only share and discuss personal information with those who need to know it.
Clearly label all files containing sensitive information. For example, for board use only.
Lock up all paper files and media, such as thumb drives or other electronic storage, containing personal information in a cabinet or case.
Password protect computers or other electronic files and ensure only people who need the information have the password.
Keep accurate records of where personal information is used and maintained.
Restrict access to offices where information is stored by only providing keys to those who need them in order to carry out their roles.
Destroy records once they are no longer needed.
Generally, the personal information that resident councils have is limited to contact information provided by the resident. If the resident council is carrying out a program or activity that requires more personal or sensitive information, such as birthdays or driver's license number, the resident council should consult the housing agency regarding applicable rules and seek training.
When collecting personally identifying information, the resident council should let members know what information is needed, why it is needed, and that sharing information is optional. The sample forms include a statement that you can use.
As you can see on the sign-in form for membership meetings, it states that while members must sign in for all meetings, contact information is optional. It also explains the reason this information is being collected, so that the board can keep members updated.
At the bottom of the form, it then explains further how the information is used. It states, the board takes safeguarding your personal information seriously. Your information will never be shared with outside parties without your permission. Providing personal information is optional. However, at times, sharing personal information is necessary to participate in resident council activities, such as running for the board or voting in an election.
These sample procedures are based on the sample bylaws provided in this toolkit. The procedures provide more detail for important resident council functions. If you have adapted or amended the bylaws, or if the board or membership of your resident council has made a decision that is different from what was suggested in the sample bylaws, you should modify these procedures to match your bylaws and decisions.
The sample procedures comply with HUD regulations for a duly elected resident council, including HUD requirements for board elections and recalls.
Your resident council can
Decide on the procedures that will work for you. There are a few places, which are noted in the directions, where you will have to follow the procedures set out by HUD in order to remain in good standing as a duly elected resident council.
have the board adopt the procedures. It's suggested that the procedures be adopted by the board of directors, not the full resident council. This way, they can be easily updated as your needs, abilities, and resources change.
Once you've decided on the procedures, you can save them, print, and share with your members.
Before we start looking at the sample forms, let's do a quick knowledge check. With regards to residents' personally identifiable information, the resident council should
A. Never collect personal information. B. Only collect information that is necessary and relevant. C. Have the PHA collect private information. Or D. All of the above.
We'll pause for a moment so you can consider your answer. Remember, you can always pause this training if you'd like to consult any of the documents in the toolkit.
If you answered B, you got it right. The resident council will sometimes need to collect information about its own members. However, the resident council should not collect personal information if it's not necessary or relevant to the work of the resident council.
One more question. The resident council can safeguard residents' personal information by
A. Locking up paper files and media. B. Password protecting computers and electronic files. C. Keeping accurate records of where personal information is used and stored. Or D. All of the above.
Again, we'll pause for you to consider your answer.
If you answered D. All of the above, you got it right. The steps you take to safeguard information will depend on how the resident council stores the information. Paper files and media should be locked up, electronic systems should be password protected, and the resident council should have accurate records of where information is stored.
Let's look at the procedures. The first section of the procedures covers membership meetings. As you can see, you are able to customize these for your resident council.
If you generally like these procedures, you can just fill in the blanks and select the options that work for your resident council. For example, under Notice on page 7, your resident council may decide that the best ways to provide notice to residents is through email and by posting notices in each hallway.
Nothing in this section is required by HUD. However, the procedures do need to comply with the bylaws. For example, if the bylaws require 7 days notice for meetings, be sure to state that here.
This next section goes over the order of business for meetings. This section can definitely be adapted for your resident council. It does provide a clear template to use to ensure that all key items are covered and that a clear process is followed. If you have a new resident council or a new president of the resident council, you may want to have those printed out to follow during the meeting. After trying this for a bit, you can see if changes are needed to better suit your organization.
The procedures suggest using Robert's Rules of Order as a basis for the decision-making process. However, the resident council may choose another process that the members prefer. Guide 3, Holding Effective Resident Council Meetings, explains consensus decision-making as another process. Whichever model your group chooses, the most important thing is that residents understand and can engage in the process.
If your group does decide to use Robert's Rules of Order, this portion of the procedures can be provided to residents to educate them on how to participate in the decision-making process. You could have printouts of pages 7 through 11 available at meetings for residents to refer to.
The document then provides sample procedures for board meetings on page 12, which are run much like membership meetings, except only board members have the right to vote.
This next section provides information on the board member responsibilities, including a description of each position.
There's also a space where you can fill in the description of any additional positions. For example, I could add a parliamentarian position.
The process for board elections starts on page 14. HUD has specific requirements for board elections, which must be followed in order to be recognized as a duly elected resident council. These requirements are listed at the beginning of the section.
The process and timeline, which start on page 15, is optional. It meets the HUD requirements and offers best practices. Your resident council may update the timeline to best fit your needs or choose another process.
Some resident councils will choose to have a shorter process where residents are nominated and elected at the same meeting, while others will choose to have an additional meeting where nominated members may speak.
Under Board of Director terms, you will need to ensure that your procedures are in line with your bylaws. HUD regulations simply require elections at least once every 3 years, which is why the maximum term is set to 3 years. You may choose whether terms are staggered and any limits on the number of terms. These rules must be included in the bylaws.
Some resident councils choose to limit terms in order to encourage new leadership. Other resident councils value having members remain in leadership positions for continuity, assuming the member is willing and continues to be elected. The sample bylaws recommend 2-year staggered terms. In order to make the term staggered, some board members will have an initial term of 1 year. 2-year terms give people an opportunity to get accustomed to their role and show results as a board member. Also, annual elections help keep members engaged.
The procedures for recall elections start on page 19. HUD regulations require written procedures for the recall of a board member or multiple board members by the membership. The process included in the sample procedures is one option that meets the requirements.
HUD requires that recall elections must
Allow for a petition or other expression by members.
set a minimum number of members, a threshold, who must agree to call for a recall election. The threshold must be at least 10% of the voting members, and
Have a third party that oversees the recall voting process.
the resident council may decide on a recall process that differs from the sample bylaws, but still meets these requirements.
HUD regulations don't specify how the board will fill vacancies that happen outside of the normal election process.
Regulations for board members do require that any appointed or elected board member meet all standard election requirements, including being lease compliant.
To maintain compliance with bylaws, board positions may remain vacant only if the board will have enough members to meet quorum.
These procedures
Give the option of finding potential candidates at the recall election who will be voted on by the board, or allowing the position to remain vacant.
The procedures also create a more streamlined process than normal elections so that the board can be fully functional as soon as possible.
If the resident council does not hold annual elections, consider a process that allows the membership to elect new board members, particularly if there is more than a year left in the term. For example, the procedures could say if the vacated position has more than 12 months left in the term, a new full election should be held following the normal election procedures.
Before moving on to the next document, let's do a knowledge check. HUD regulations require
A. That board elections take place at least once every 3 years. B. That board members serve no more than 2 terms. C. That board vacancies during a term are filled through a vote of all members. Or D. All of the above.
We'll pause while you consider your answer.
The correct answer is A. Board elections must take place at least every 3 years. HUD does not require a term limit for board members, though you can add one to your bylaws. HUD also does not require a specific procedure to fill midterm board vacancies.
True or false? Under the sample procedures, only a board member can make a proposal during a resident council meeting.
We'll pause while you consider your answer.
If you answered false, you got it. Any member can make a proposal during a resident council meeting according to the sample procedures.
We'll now move on to the sample forms for resident council meetings. This document provides customizable forms to carry out the procedures related to resident council meetings.
This first form on page 4 can be used by the resident council to request space from management. Your resident council will need to discuss the conditions outlined in the proposed form and see if they work for management. If you want to add any fields, you can simply copy the text here and paste it into another document to use as a starting point, or add an additional page. If there are clauses that don't apply, you can cross them off on your form.
The next two forms, pages 5 and 6, can be used as notices for resident council meetings. The form on page 5 has more space to include agenda items.
The flyer on page 6 has less space for agenda items, but is more attention grabbing.
Page 7 includes a customizable agenda. The resident council secretary may want to save a copy of this form to update for each meeting. It can then be saved with the notes.
Page 8 is a sign-in sheet for meetings. You will notice that the sheet lets people know that their contact information is optional, but that it is helpful for outreach. At the bottom is the statement on how residents' personal information is safeguarded. You can type residents' information into this form, but most likely you will print out copies and have people fill it in when they arrive.
Page 9 can be used by the secretary to take notes, called minutes, at membership meetings. They will likely want to save these pages and type directly into the form. However, if the secretary is not comfortable with typing, they can write directly onto a printed form.
The schedule of the Board of Directors meetings on page 11 is a form that can be hung in common areas of the property to inform residents on when the board regularly meets. This way, the board does not have to let the membership know every month about its meetings. It can just stay posted. The form does permit members to attend board meetings, which is generally a good practice for transparency and building leadership. If there is an issue that involves member privacy, the board has the option of closing part of the meeting. And the board does not have to allow members to vote or participate in the meeting.
Page 12 is a sign-in sheet for board meetings. Residents who are not board members who are present are also asked to sign in.
The final 2 pages provide a minutes form that a secretary can use for board minutes.
This next document provides the sample forms for resident council elections to help the resident council comply with the requirements set by HUD and the sample bylaws and procedures in this toolkit. These forms may be modified and adapted by your resident council.
The first form, on page 4, is an election checklist. It can be used by the board to ensure that they are setting up the elections in compliance with HUD rules, and an election judge can use this form to certify that the election was done properly.
Pages 5 and 6 have the initial notice for the board elections that will be provided to all residents. As you can see, the form allows you to select the positions that are up for election. The eligibility requirements follow HUD guidelines and the sample bylaws, but provide space for any additional requirements.
You should likely vet any additional requirements with the housing agency or a lawyer to ensure that they are non-discriminatory. They then provide information on the nomination and election process to residents.
On page 7, the final notice of election of board members to the resident council provides the basic information that residents will need to participate in the elections, including the names of everyone nominated. There is also space to allow for additional nominations.
The next page has the same information, but is formatted to be more visually appealing.
Page 9 provides a candidate nomination form, including the same eligibility requirements.
The next form on page 10 is an election ballot tracking form. This form is intended for use by a member of the housing agency staff or third-party election monitor in order to ensure that only qualified residents receive a ballot.
The signature field is intended as confirmation that the resident has received the ballot. Alternative tracking methods are also acceptable, particularly given that a signature is personal information that must be safeguarded.
The next 2 pages, 11 and 12, provide a form to certify the winners of the resident council election. Elected residents are asked to share their personal contact information so that they can be reached by members.
The Board of Directors Public Contact Information form on pages 13 and 14 provides a space for newly elected board members to share contact information with the residents. Board members should be accessible to the general membership, but may want to be selective about the contact information they share. Resident councils often offer a resident council specific phone number or email address that will be provided to the public.
Finally, page 15 includes a petition form that residents may use to recall a board member.
One final knowledge check question. You may have to consult the sample procedures for this one. How many days' notice do the sample procedures recommend for the initial notice for a resident council election?
A, 7, B, 30, C, 45, or D, 60.
We'll pause for a moment for you to consider your answer.
If you chose C, 45 days, you got it. The 45-day notice is a recommendation and isn't required by HUD. Some resident councils provide less notice in accordance with their bylaws or procedures.
This training is part of the Public Housing Resident Organizing and Participation Toolkit. The full toolkit includes topical guides, customizable resident council documents and forms, tools related to tenant participation funds, and case studies of resident organizations around the country.
This training marks the end of the training series. Congratulations, and thank you for participating.